I'm Alan Wood, a partner in the Clyde & Co Middle East corporate team, and I'm joined today by my colleague Irma Kamani for the next in our series exploring the developments shaping the business, investment and regulatory environments across the region. Our focus today is the UAE, and in particular we'll be discussing how recent legislative changes are likely to impact how investors can protect control while raising capital. So let's start with what's fundamentally different now. For the first time, UAE mainland LLCs can issue multiple classes of shares with different economic and voting rights attached to each class. As a reminder, historically, those same LLCs were, from a statutory perspective at least, effectively limited to a single class of shares, which meant that if existing shareholders wanted to sell or issue new shares, they were diluted in relation to both their financial stake and their control. Raising capital therefore felt somewhat binary. The options were either to keep control and self-fund or bring in third-party investors and accept that there would be an unavoidable level of financial and control dilution.
Multi-class shares have now changed that equation. You can now, at least conceptually, issue preferred or non-voting shares to investors while the founders or family, in the case of family businesses, retain voting control. That's a big shift for onshore companies. These frameworks were predominantly available in the DIFC or ADGM, or via more complex contractual arrangements that weren't necessarily always enforceable. Now, protection mechanisms around control can be built into an LLC's constitution, as opposed to only within shareholder or other private arrangements.
Okay, so let's get practical. When we say protect control while raising capital, what do multiple classes of shares actually give investors or founders the ability to do? Well, three things mainly. First, you can issue shares with enhanced voting rights for founders, while investors, third-party investors that is, invest to obtain economic interests with limited or no voting rights. Second, and balancing that first point, those investors can get protection, like preferred dividends or liquidation preferences, without necessarily needing board or shareholder control. Third, combined with the new provisions allowing for tag and drag-along rights, which we're going to cover in a later episode in this series, it's possible to design and build in exit mechanisms at an early stage that don't necessarily require unanimity at the time of an exit.
From a governance perspective, this matters because control can be further calibrated. That's particularly relevant in founder-led or family-led businesses where long-term direction matters just as much as capital. But on the flip side, multi-class structures can entrench control as much as they can protect it, which is why clear and unambiguous drafting is so important. Let's look at venture capitals. Traditionally, VCs wanted a preferred financial interest and certain control mechanisms, like board seats and vetoes, because LLCs couldn't easily separate the two. But now, VC funds can accept reduced voting control, provided their financial interest is properly protected, through liquidation preference, preferred dividends, or class-based protections, for example. That's helpful for founders who want to preserve strategic control.
Turning then to private equity, they tend to look at the equation slightly differently. In particular, private equity typically wants both its financial interest and a degree of control through reserve matters, board rights, exit certainty, etc. A multi-class share structure can help private equity by implementing control provisions in constitutional documents, for example, class votes on key matters, rather than relying on purely contractual vetoes. Likewise, the ability to build in an entitlement to preferential and or cumulative dividends, as we mentioned earlier. Again, the drafting will be important because Memorandum of Association will need to explicitly and clearly reflect such rights and ensure that there's no room for ambiguity. So in other words, private equity can have cleaner control, provided that the constitutional documents are robust, precise, and of course registrable with the relevant government departments.
Moving on to another key shareholder group in the context of the UAE, family businesses, for which this reform may be the most impactful. A consistent challenge for family-owned businesses is how to accommodate successive generations at an ownership level while maintaining a manageable management structure. Multi-class structures allow families to centralize control in one branch or generation, while allowing broader family members to participate financially through non-voting dividend shares, which of course also makes it easier to bring in external capital without fracturing family governance. Likewise, the new provisions introduced, which allow shareholders to agree and enshrine mechanisms to address how a deceased shareholder's interests will be treated, and a right of first refusal for existing shareholders to acquire that interest may provide a useful mechanism to avoid those shareholdings passing outside of the immediate family in certain situations. But it also introduces a risk. If dividend policy and information rights aren't clear, then shareholders whose participation is limited to a financial interest can feel locked out. Family sensitivities will need to be taken into account. A multi-class structure preserves control, but it doesn't guarantee harmony.
Before we finish, I need to probably add a word of caution. While the law introduces the availability to have multiple classes of shares, not all of the details are yet settled. Several points are still evolving, including, for example, the extent to which the relevant company registration offices and registries will accept complex bespoke provisions in Memorandum of Association, how conversion mechanisms will need to be drafted, and whether templates, at least in terms of Memorandum of Association again, will vary materially between the different emirates.
Which is why we're advising clients to treat this very much as a phased implementation. Build flexibility into documents, expect iterations, and don't assume universal acceptance on day one across each emirate. And always remember, when you're onshore, the Arabic text prevails. It remains to be seen what these new changes will look like in practice with the authorities. These amendments continue to reshape the UAE's corporate environment with meaningful implications for business operations, governance, and investment strategy. We expect further developments as regulators refine the framework, and we hope to see greater clarity and alignment that support both local and international investors.
That brings us to the end of this session, but if you'd like to discuss how these developments may impact you and your business and investment strategy, please feel free to reach out to our corporate team across the Middle East and Africa. In the meantime, we hope that you'll be able to join us and our colleagues as we share additional insights in upcoming conversations. Thank you for joining us.